Welcome everyone to this next installment of the Green Shoot series. We're very excited to have you all present here today. And in this webinar series, for those people that are new and are joining for the first time today, we highlight the diversity of research that we do in the WildE project and all of the young talent that we also have as part of our consortium. So quickly, as a reminder for everyone, what is WildE? Well, WildE is a project funded by the European Commission that looks at rewilding as a climate smart solution to both the climate and biodiversity crisis. And in this project, we look at climate smart rewilding at 8 different sites across Europe and assessing the rewilding approach in all of these sites. And we do some sort of general research as well. And in this project, we have a great team of researchers from all over Europe. And in this webinar series, we present the work. So we're looking forward to continue to showcase some of this diversity. Today, we have the first in a 2-part series. So if you like what you're seeing today, and if you're interested to learn more, please also join us on the 20th of May, when will be the second installment of this series. With that, I am very excited to announce who we have today. We have Miriam, Ella, and Rodrigo, all from CREAF in Barcelona, and they work on the role of disturbances in rewilding, and they will jointly present some of their findings today. With that, Miriam, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Tim. Hello everyone, my name is Miriam. I'm a postdoctoral researcher at CREAF, Barcelona, and today, together with my colleagues, Ella and Rodrigo, we are going to talk about the role of disturbances in rewilding. So first, I will start by learning from past actions, presenting our research on the impact of rewilding on ecosystem resilience to disturbances. So I would like to start by briefly introducing that rewilding aims to promote complex self-regulating ecosystems by targeting 3 interacting ecological processes, which include trophic complexity, dispersal, and stochastic disturbances. Also, many authors have stated that targeting these 3 components in rewilding aim, among others, to increase ecosystem resilience to disturbances. However, measuring resilience in rewilding projects can be challenging, as there are multiple approaches and dimensions of resilience in response to disturbances, which can difficult resilience assessments. As we can see in this example, there are multiple outcomes and alternative reorganization stages of a community after a disturbance event. Luckily, different frameworks are emerging to quantify resilience, and here we will focus on the operational resilience framework, which provides a unified terminology, a sequence of 8 steps to assess resilience, and recognize and relate several elements for the resilience assessment. So some of these elements include resilience approaches, whether the resilience is ecological, socio-ecological, or engineering resilience, the system variables of which we measure resilience from, the disturbances and stresses affecting the study site, the reference state to compare with, and finally, the resilience predictors, which are those manageable attributes that we can modify and that will finally affect the resilience outcome. And here is where we can include those actions aimed at restoring any of the 3 rewilding components, which include trophic complexity, stochastic disturbances, and dispersal. So the main objectives of this research were to analyze the available literature assessing resilience in rewilding projects, analyze whether rewilding projects aim at increasing trophic complexity, dispersal, and stochastic disturbances increase ecosystem resilience to disturbances, and specifically assess which rewilding interventions targeting trophic complexity may increase ecosystem resilience. So for such, we searched the literature using a meta-analytical approach and selected a total number of 42 articles composed of 305 measurements of system variables. If you remember, these variables are the ones we are going to measure resilience with. From these articles, we extracted data on rewilding, on disturbances, and on resilience. So to quantify resilience, we extracted from each measurement the mean, the variation, and the sample sizes of the system variables categorized into demography, biodiversity, biophysical, and disturbance regime characteristics for both the treatment and the control. The treatment would correspond to the rewilding and the control to the non-rewilding. We conducted two different analytical approaches. The first one was a qualitative analysis where we applied a vote counting and a classification tree analysis on the directional effect of each measure, whether this effect was positive, neutral, or negative for resilience. And secondly, we applied a quantitative analysis by applying mixed modeled adjusted for meta-analysis. Our characterization of the 305 measurements corresponding to the 42 studies showed that we did not find any primary studies targeting the dispersal rewilding component, that most studies targeted the trophic complexity component, the demographic system variables were mostly analyzed, biotic disturbances were most frequent, and less studies targeted socio-ecological systems. Okay, in this figure, we can see the proportion of observations for the directional effect of each rewilding component, trophic complexity, stochastic disturbances, and trophic complexity and stochastic disturbances together on ecosystem resilience. In green, we can see those positive effects for resilience, in gray, those neutral ones, and in red, those negative ones. And we found that most rewilding components showed positive effects, almost 70%, however, also some neutral and negative effects for resilience. The same patterns were observed for all system variable categories, which were those related to the demographic processes, biodiversity, biophysical, and disturbance regime characteristics, and for the most representative trophic rewilding interventions, which were animal introductions, animal removals, plant introductions, and plant removals. And again, as we can see in green, we mostly encountered positive effects of rewilding on all these variables. Starting with the meta-analysis results, we found an overall increase of resilience for all rewilding components, which was moderated for all system variable categories, for the engineering and the ecological resilience. For the resilience dimension, this is resistance and recovery together. For biotic disturbances, for those gradual and recurrent disturbances, and for all ecosystem types. However, we found negative effects for those abiotic disturbances, such as droughts or wildfires, and especially this was encountered when the aim was to recover the pre-disturbance state of the system. And finally, when focusing on the most representative trophic rewilding interventions, which were animal introductions and removals and plant introductions and removals, we also found an overall increase of resilience. To sum up these results, we observed that rewilding generally increased ecosystem resilience to disturbances, and therefore targeting rewilding components in restoration efforts could contribute significantly to enhance resilience to climate change. However, we also found that rewilding is not a one-size-fits-all solution, especially in the context of extreme abiotic disturbance events such as droughts and wildfires, indicating that species promoted by rewilding may lack the adaptive flexibility to adapt to rapidly changing abiotic conditions. So these results make us question whether promoting stochastic disturbances could become an alternative in those cases where rewilding does not seem to work, as we saw, for instance, for abiotic disturbances. For example, in this fire example, when natural disturbances are suppressed, they may result in more catastrophic events which limit the recovery after disturbances. However, by promoting the natural disturbance regime, we could reduce disturbance severity and enhance ecosystem recovery. So further questions rise on whether we could obtain further benefits for climate change adaptation by targeting more realistic approaches of rewilding and resilience. Also, if the previous state becomes no longer a suitable reference state, which one should we consider instead? And finally, will it be possible to manage abiotic threats by placing stronger emphasis on the disturbance rewilding component? So thank you very much. And now I give the floor to Ella, who will speak about proposing actions for the future, sharing her conceptual framework for restoring fire regimes through rewilding.
Thanks, Miriam. I hope you can all hear me. So as Miriam has given us a really nice kind of overview of learning from past actions of rewilding for disturbance, I'm going to be talking a little bit about some work that me and some colleagues have been doing on trying to come up with future pathways for restoring fire regimes through rewilding. And so this is a bit of preaching to the converted, but why do we need rewilding? So as you know, we're having a major biodiversity crisis at the moment. And apart from biodiversity's intrinsic value, we also just really need biodiversity for food, medicine, energy, and water. And it's obvious that at the moment, we're not quite doing a very good job of protecting that biodiversity. So we're hoping that rewilding might be one of these kind of approaches that we might use to restore ecosystem resilience, as Miriam's given us a very nice overview of, and promote biodiversity as well. So when I say rewilding, what do I mean by that? And in the context of this presentation, I'm going to be talking around the restoration of these ecological processes. So trophic complexity, natural disturbance, and dispersal, as Miriam gave us a nice overview of, with the goal of restoring functioning socio-ecological systems. Sorry, the slide control is going a bit slowly here. Hopefully that changes. Okay, yes. So in terms of this framework on rewilding, there is already a lot of really excellent work on the trophic complexity component. So you might recognize approaches that are focused on restoring carnivores or herbivory, but there's less sort of emphasis on disturbance that's been explored. And so this includes wildfires. And so this is a problem because fire regimes are an important and changing force in many systems. So you'll recognize this photo from Los Angeles fire earlier in the year. And it's clear that the fire regimes are actually changing and having a very large impact. So this is a system that's very close to my heart. It's where I did my PhD. It's in the southern eastern corner of Victoria in Australia. And so this is a map from 2021. This is a quite sort of intact natural park. And you'll see that from this map in 2021, there was already a large proportion of the park that was burnt in the last 20 years. And this is a problem because some work that me and some other colleagues did found that actually these short times between fires are already posing a risk to many species and communities in the park. And you can see this across a range of scales. So this is at a species level. So in terms of relative abundance, species are less present at shorter time since fire, but you can also see it in a demographic way too. This is looking at the proportion of mature plants across high and low severity classes. And we found that it takes up to 10 years for there to be 50% of mature plants at a site. So in those very short times since fire, you have less opportunity for recruitment. And we can also see this at a community level too. So this is in a seed bank. In the seed bank, we found that at shorter years time since fire for annual species with long-lived seed, you're much less likely to find them there. And this is data that we collected in 2021. And now, so this is actually a photo from this year. So this is from the 29th of January. These red spots are the active fires in the park on that day. That very dark red patch is a fire scar from earlier, from February 2024, so last year. And that massive grey patch, it was from just 1 month before the active fire. So this is from December 2024, and that's a 76,000 hectare fire. And you might recognize from that very first map that I showed from 2021 that this area was the bit that was unburnt for the last 40 years. So what we're seeing is that these fire regimes are rapidly evolving and posing new risks to ecological function, so things that we're not seeing before. And this is something that is happening across the world. So this is a kind of a proportion of threatened species that have fire regimes listed as a threat. And for example, in gymnosperms, we can see about 28% of them that are threatened by fire regimes. So this is a global sort of issue at the moment. And so how might we use rewilding to restore fire regimes for the benefit of biodiversity and ecological function? And we wanted to figure this out. So we started by thinking about the switches that determine the passage of fire. So when we think about a fire event, we can think about fire weather needed to carry a fire across the landscape. So hot and windy days, we need to have available fuel. So that's the biomass that's available, and that fuel needs to be dry enough, and there needs to be an ignition source too. And so there's also another switch that isn't traditionally considered a switch, which is suppression. So it doesn't determine whether or not fire starts, but does determine if it continues in the landscape. And when we think about fire events over time, they form these spatial patterns that form a fire regime. And in the last, especially in the last 100 years, these intensive anthropogenic pressures have altered fire regimes. So climate change has altered the number of days that we have fire weather in the landscape. And things like agricultural abandonment, for example, have influenced fuel availability, among a lot of other different types of drivers. The lack of ignition. So for example, many places, humans have been taken out of the landscape and stopped ignitions, or we've, on the contrast, we've actually put more ignitions into the landscape in some areas. There's been these hydrological changes in the landscape that have changed fuel dryness. And also we've implemented suppression in terms of its intensity and spatial arrangement. And I guess the big one to think about is climate change, right? It influences all these switches, and it influences fire weather, and no really other anthropogenic lever is able to change that. But the other switches that we have, so fuel availability, fuel dryness, ignition source, and suppression, the fact that we are having kind of localized influences on these highlight there is an opportunity to target them with rewilding approaches too. So how might we harness those ecological processes to target these switches? We wanted to think about this. And I guess one of the key ways to do this is to think about the links between the ecological processes. So fire influences trophic complexity through individuals, through birth and death, but also through the interactions, these trophic interactions that are happening. So fire directly influences things like competition between plants and animals. It influences disease and parasitism, and it also influences the facilitation of food and resources. And trophic complexity, in turn, influences fire through the alteration of fuel availability, for example, and the alteration of ignitions. And we can see, for example, that there's some raptors that actually carry fire and start fires for their own benefit, which is pretty cool. And fire also influences dispersal. So one of the other key ecological processes in that rewilding framework. So fire influences whether or not species can move in the landscape, and dispersal also influences fuel connectivity. So if you think about invasive species, for example, and dispersal, of course, is a demographic process in itself. So that influences trophic complexity. And all of these come together in this quite complicated figure here, but there's a lot of interactions that are happening between fire, trophic complexity, and dispersal and biodiversity. And we can harness those to come up with some pathways for rewilding to restore fire regimes. And we also need to think about the fact that fire occurs within a suite of other ecological processes that are occurring differently across ecosystems. So for example, in trophic savannas, fire is occurring very frequently, sort of annually or biannually. And it's also interacting with a very strong influence of herbivory in the landscape. Whether in boreal and temperate forests, fire is occurring at sort of multi-decadal cycles, 100 years, something like that. And there's other processes that are occurring with fire. So any pathway to restoring fire regimes through rewilding must really account for these differences. And so we were thinking about some of the ways in which we might target those switches by pulling levers that target those, restore those ecological processes. So for example, for fuel availability, an example rewilding action might be to restore herbivory into the landscape. For ignition source, it might be restoring burning into the landscape in a mosaic fashion. For fuel dryness, it could be something like reintroducing hydrological engineers, which might change the flow of water in the landscape. And finally, suppression, you might target, for example, reduce that suppression intensity and restore disturbance that way. And so we propose that to a pathway for rewilding fire. First, you might actually characterize what the dynamics and limits of these ecological processes are and abiotic dependencies within an ecosystem. You then might be able to identify what those target switches are in terms of what's driving fire regimes in the landscape and what you might do to alter them. And also, my headphone just fell out. Hopefully that wasn't really loud and everyone's ear. And select possible rewilding actions based on those switches. And finally, whoops, now my slides are gone. Monitor and evaluate success. So this is just the start of the conversation. Obviously, there's lots of really exciting work to be done, and we're hoping that this might be an opportunity to propose actions that might be explicitly tested. And this is essentially exactly what Rodrigo is going to be talking about now, which is some opportunities to test some explicit actions for fire and rewilding in the Barcelona landscape. So I'll pass over to him.
Yes, thanks, Ella. Yes, well, as Ella was saying, I'm going to describe you the work we have been carried out in the Barcelona case study, in which we are assessing how extreme drought events and landscape management strategies can interact to reduce fire connectivity. So, well, given a little bit of context and following the introduction of Ella, the Barcelona metropolitan region has experienced an increase in wildfire risk due to a combination of factors. In one hand, we have the climate change and global warming enhancing fire weather and the intensity and duration of extreme drought events. And in the other hand, the region has experienced a forest expansion processes after the abandonment of former agricultural lands that had increased the degree of connectivity among forest patches and thus the degree of connectivity for a potential wildfire. And well, finally, also the Barcelona metropolitan region is experiencing an expansion of the wild and urban interface areas that have increased the degree of exposure of people and infrastructures to wildfire. So considering these factors and focusing on the projected increase of extreme drought events, our question in this study are the first one, how will fire connectivity is going to be affected by extreme drought events in the coming decades. And then we also sought to assess to which extent we can take advantage of this stochastic disturbance, these extreme drought events, in combination with landscape management strategies to reduce this wildfire connectivity. So, well, here we have the study area, the location of the Barcelona metropolitan region. And in this map, we are representing the land covers. In green, we have the wildland areas, including both shrublands and forest. And what we have done is to first rasterize this study area. And in each pixel that records a wildland land cover, we have simulated forest dynamics and functionality. What we have done is to simulate this forest dynamics using Medfed land from 2050 to 2050 under two climatic scenarios, one with a high incidence of extreme drought events and the other with a lower incidence. And we have simulated these dynamics replicating the current management activities in the region that are mostly known. So we can count this first scenario as a passive management strategy or a business as usual. And then what we have done is to simulate a landscape management strategy in which we carry out partial salvage logging activities over the drought-affected stands. So if a forest stand has recorded a mortality higher than 5%, we simulate that we extract this dead wood, and we did not incorporate this dead vegetation in the wildfire modeling. So while the wildfire modeling, we have using the FCCA's models to model the fire behavior. And then we have modeled the fire connectivity in these two periods, a current period and two future periods, with the both climatic scenarios using the OmniScape algorithm. And here we are representing the current fire connectivity in the Barcelona metropolitan region as the average values for the 2020-2023 period. Well, the light areas, light colored areas represent the areas that would facilitate the spread of a wildfire in the region. And we have observed some correlation among the distribution of these high fire connectivity areas and the stands dominated by coniferous species, specifically by Pinus alepensis. So, well, regarding the future fire connectivity, here we are representing the average values for the 2040 to 2050 period in the both climatic scenarios, the low drought and the high drought. And we are representing the delta values. That means how it's going to change fire connectivity from the current period to the future one. And well, the results are from the simulations of the passive management scenario or the business as usual. So in both climatic scenarios, we have observed that it's going to be a reduction of fire connectivity mediated by the forest dynamic processes and the drought effects. So to isolate these drought effects, we subtract one result to another, and well, we are representing in these histograms in terms of what amount of surface in the Barcelona metropolitan region that records different connectivity classes is going to change. So we observed that is going to be an increase of the areas with low fire connectivity classes and a decrease of the areas with high fire connectivity classes. And thus, drought is going to reduce fire connectivity in the middle term. And this is because drought reduces the basal area of the stands, increase the mortality rate, and thus decrease the number of trees in the long term. And drought reduce the fine fuels that drive the fire behavior and the fire connectivity. So, well, these are the effects of drought in the long term, no, to the final of the simulated period. But when we look at the short term, we can observe that here we are representing the low drought and the high drought scenarios in purple and orange, the aridity index, the fire connectivity, and the fuel loads. So in the panel B, we can observe that fire connectivity is lower in the high drought scenario because of the effects of drought that we were telling before. But during extreme drought year, that the 2049, that we record a peak of deadfall loads that causes a peak in fire connectivity that is higher than any other value in the low drought scenario. So despite average fire connectivity decrease in the middle term mediated by drought effects, it can also increase in the short term. So here is when it makes sense the implementation of the salvage logging scenario that we have modeled. We can see here that under a low drought climatic scenario, the application of these landscape management strategies does not produce any significant effect. But when we have simulated forest dynamics with a higher incidence of extreme drought events, and we take advantage of these drought perturbations by carrying out this partial salvage logging, we observe a high reduction of the fire connectivity in the whole the Barcelona metropolitan region. So, well, that were the results, and here are the main conclusions or highlights. The first one is that drought disturbance reduce fire connectivity in the long term, despite it can also increase it in the short term. And our second conclusion is that we can take advantage of this drought disturbance by carrying out partial salvage logging of the drought affected stands to reduce the fire connectivity. So, well, that was all. Thank you very much for your attention. And now we are going to start the
Yes,
questionnaire part.
thank you, Ella, Miriam, Rodrigo. Very interesting, different ways how disturbance and rewilding work together. For the next session, we will be very interested to actually hear from all of you who are attending today. For that, we will be using an online tool called Mentimeter. If you haven't used it before, it's very easy. So you don't need an account, or you don't need to sign up. Just use your laptop or a smartphone, go to the website menti.com and enter the code on the screen. And there will be a number of questions that we would like to hear your answer to, get your input on. If you have other questions that we are not listening in this Mentimeter, please put them in the chat and we will address them in the Q&A following this Mentimeter session. So please use the code and sign and answer the questions. And Megan, if we could already go and see the first question. Well, perhaps go back for a little bit more, because if you don't see any responses coming in, and maybe people will still need the code. So leave it up on the screen for a second more. Yes, I think hopefully everyone has gotten the code. If not, we will put it in the chat as well. But yes, please move forward to the first question. So the first question: what is the most frequent disturbance type in Europe? Well, we're seeing some responses coming in. They're not so much the responses yet that you have been talking about a lot about the wildfires, although they're coming in now a little bit. How do you see these answers coming in, Ella, Miriam?
Yes, well, this was a quite tricky question because it depends, no, in the part of Europe you live, no? Probably if you are living in North Europe, you can see more frequent floods or maybe pests that in South Europe, where we can see the wildfires or the drought of the main disturbances. And also, it is a quite tricky question because all these answers can change if we ask, what do you think is going to be the future most frequent disturbance considering climate change effects, no? But well, we can see that now drought and pest are at the same level. And yes, also all these disturbances can interact each with others, no? Because first we have the drought, but then these make more biomass or fuels to be more available to fire, and then we can land in more wildfire events. And well, at the same with pest events.
And Miriam, you did a study looking at a lot of different articles around disturbances. What were the frequent disturbances type that sort of came on for you when you were looking at all the literature? Miriam, could you please unmute yourself?
Sorry for that. I wasn't aware. Yes, thank you, Tim. The main disturbance types we found were mostly biotic disturbances, such as pest or invasive species, but we did also find a lot of wildfire and drought events.
Interesting. So it does reflect a bit what we're seeing on the screen. If we could go to the second question. So the question is, do you see disturbances primarily as an opportunity or as a threat to rewilding? But while the questions are coming in yourselves, well, what do you think yourself, Ella, Miriam, Rodrigo? How do you see this?
Yeah, this question, we were interested in hearing people's perspectives. I think so. We're a bit biased in that I think we're working on from the perspective that disturbances are an opportunity, and I mean it's nice to see lots of people thinking that as well. And I guess disturbances form a natural part of ecological processes as well. So we do want you to be able to harness them. But I think there's also the case that climate change is creating very different forms of disturbances in the landscape. So fires are more frequent and fires are more intense in lots of places. And that is difficult to know what to do with. And I can understand why it might be perceived as a threat, particularly in the context of, socio-ecological values, not just ecological values, but also the very real threat of, for example, lives and assets being lost, as we saw the Los Angeles fires more recently. And something that Miriam is leading, maybe I'll let her speak a little bit about that. But we're hoping to think about ways in which we might actually use disturbances as an opportunity for rewilding. So, for example, the stuff that Rodrigo just presented, that was a disturbance as an opportunity. So drought as something that we could use to reduce wildfire risk in Barcelona. So there are really nice ways in which we can actually harness the links between disturbances to hopefully have really good outcomes for biodiversity or for social ecological values. But Miriam, I'll let you have a go at that.
Yes, absolutely. And I fully agree with Ella. And something very important is also to consider the economic side of it. So what will be the cost of these disturbances, and also what would be the cost of rewilding? So if these disturbances do give us an opportunity for rewilding, then it's something that we should definitely be looking into.
Very interesting. So maybe something we will hear more about in the coming years from you all. Could we move to the third question? So this is more of an open question where we would love to hear your input, but the question is, should we promote historical ecosystems through rewilding, or should we tailor them to these new climatic conditions? We've been talking about climate change and how this affects disturbances. So we would love to hear from you as the audience what you think, and naturally this can be a yes, no, but you could also tell maybe a little bit about how you think we should tailor them. So the first response that comes in is the big elephant in the room, the climate change. For you, or how do you think this relationship works between these new climatic conditions and these historical ecosystems? Do you think we can go back to some sort of baseline, or what is your personal opinion about this as well?
Okay, so there's not a lot of comments on this question, never mind. Okay, here they come. Tailoring makes more sense. I think rewilding leads to adaptation anyway. Make them more resilient, adapting to new realities. Okay, so mostly agree that rewilding should be tailored to new conditions, and absolutely, if historical ecosystems are no longer viable due to these changing climatic conditions, we should consider tailoring them to the new conditions. And yes, and this approach should ensure that ecosystems remain functional. And regarding the reference state we were talking about before, this one should be dynamic. We should consider ecological resilience, species adaptability, future climate change projections. Yes, I agree with a lot of the comments that
There's some really interesting comments here, actually. I like this one that's sort of in the center for note now, that I have difficulty to accept the term historical ecosystems. I think that's a really good point, and something that makes a lot of sense. It's sort of this idea about how far do we take the baseline in terms of where you go back if we were to use a historical ecosystem approach, at what point does that historical ecosystem begin, and do we go back before humans even existed, or things like that. And there was also a really nice comment, I thought, around using the processes as the target, process-led, not target-led. I think for me, that's one of the most exciting things around rewilding, is this idea that we can use the processes themselves, or the limits of those processes, as the target in themselves. So you might be able to factor in biotic or abiotic interactions that are influencing the limits of those systems too. So for example, if you are expecting a species to have a specific response to fire, and that would determine how frequently you would burn, perhaps that's no longer going to be possible if it takes a longer time for that species to mature under reduced precipitation or something like that. So it's nice to be able to use those ecological processes as the limits of the balance. I think that's a really exciting opportunity with rewilding.
Very interesting. There are some really nice questions in the chat as well. The first few, please, if you have more, please put them in the chat. But I would like to move to that part. So if you could close the Mentimeter, then I would like to start with the first question. And I think that question might be best asked to Miriam, but please feel free, of course, as all three, to answer it as appropriate. But the first question is like, would the negative effect of fire not be because the area is too small for the animals to move to a not burned area? So we saw some negative effects of fire on this resilience, and they give an example of that there are some plants like Venus flytraps who rely on regular flyers to get light. So some species might benefit even if only small areas are left. How do you see this sort of dispersal and fire combination?
Yes, absolutely. The negative effects can be the negative effect of fire not be because the area is too small. Yes, absolutely. The area might be too small, but also we found in our case studies, the 42 case studies we reviewed the ones that faced abiotic disturbances. We found that mostly the biodiversity and the demographic variables assessed were not able to recover. So this would be also an effect of time. Maybe there has not been enough time for these species to move towards this disturbed area. This could be one of the effects as well. But also the possibility that there are not enough new species to recruit. So yes, this would be related also to the dispersal as well. So yes, absolutely, it could be a possibility.
One of the things that question makes me think of as well is, so I guess like coming back to that, the limits of ecological processes, or how they interact with other drivers. So I guess like, whether or not a fire happens, whether or not a species, so the Venus flytrap, for example, can tolerate a certain fire regime, might be dependent on the landscape around the fire. So if there's fragmentation or logging, that's going to affect the ability for a plant to disperse. So that could also be something that's a an interaction that's happening with fires as well.
Interesting. And I have a second question here, and I think this one it was asked during the session of Ella, and that is, what is the role of fire disturbance in a system where we don't really have full trophic complexity, right? Where we are missing apex predators like in the UK, and we might have a disproportionate number of herbivores like deer. Would this be beneficial from a fire perspective if you have a increased herbivory?
Yeah, so I think that comes back to this idea that different ecosystems and contexts have got different, I guess, transformations or different, like, you know, limits of ecological processes and how they're formed, but also how they've changed over time. And in this context, without knowing very much about the context, it sounds like perhaps there's an overabundance of herbivores and potentially an action to restore fuel. So if you wanted more fire regimes, then you might be able to use the introduction of carnivores to reduce herbivores and target that fuel regime. That fuel layer for fire regimes to increase. But the evidence in terms of the success of carnivores in actually reducing herbivory for fuel is not very well understood, as I understand it. So it's still partially because the numbers of carnivores that you would need to be able to reduce herbivory in a meaningful way. But that's part of what's exciting about this, right, is that we can test these ideas. And I think that's a really nice idea from Alana.
Rodrigo and Miriam, would you have anything to add to this impact? Okay.
No, I agree with Ella.
Then the next question is actually sort of a double question. So you referred to it already, Miriam, the time that systems might be needed and the differences that people might have in how much time they allow for a system to recover, right? So for you, what would be sort of an adequate time frame that you look at to see whether such a system recovers after disturbances and becomes resilient or not? That is one question. And in the conversations you've had with everyone, for all three, do you see differences between groups of people? Maybe, you know, you come more from an ecologist point of view, you might have a longer time frame, but if you talk to people, practitioners, foresters, or others, people in the field, do you see other time frames when you're talking about recovery from disturbance and the impacts of disturbance?
Absolutely, yes. Well, many studies agree that the longer the time frame, the more the ecosystem will be recovered. So there's a lot of literature that argues this, but I would not only consider timeframes, but I would consider the reference state. Yes, so the time you require to achieve a certain reference state, which would be, it can be a tailored reference state to the new conditions, it could be the previous state, it can be a desired state. So obviously the time that is required for achieving this reference state, which is the one that we would consider recovered, the one we are comparing our rewilding to, is more important. So not as much the time frames involved, but the reference you want to achieve.
Yes.
Rodrigo, yes, you please go ahead.
Yes, I will go with the second part of the question, and absolutely yes, no? I think there are different perceptions about the restoring or the rewilding of ecosystem, depending on your approach, no? For example, for us, or at least for me, from a more ecology perspective, and following and answering the questions, what's about which is an historical ecosystem? So maybe we can search more for ecological functions that cover determinate ecosystems and look at recovery about that functions. But for example, for a point of view of a forest manager, for example, or a stakeholder in a determinate forest plantation, it will recover the same species and the same production, no? So yes, I think there is a gap here, no, between what means resilience or recover for different type of people depending on the background, no?
And for you, you have a message to the people who work with fire in the greater Barcelona metropolitan region that over the long term, drought will reduce fires. But of course, they see in the short term also the effects of drought. How does it work for you trying to explain these long term perspectives to people who are dealing also with short term impacts?
Yeah, that's it. I think most of the people, and for sure the people who is in the area or who has interest in the area or infrastructure, etc., will show the short-term impacts more seriously than the long-term, no? It doesn't matter for me that in the middle of the century is going to be reduced the fire connectivity if the next year my house is going to be burned, no? So it's like this trade-off between both, and there I think it takes place our message about taking advantage of this disturbance. No, we can take advantage of this drought impact specifically during that drought years and reduce the fire connectivity in the short and in the long term.
Wonderful. I just want to highlight that if you have any additional questions that you don't feel comfortable posing now or they come after the webinar, feel free to also just send us an email and we'll be happy to answer some of the questions. And also note that the recording of this webinar will be made available online later. So if you have people you would like to share it to on the YouTube channel, it will be available to share at a later stage. As I don't see any other questions come in, but please, we have some time, so if you feel if there's something, please put it in the chat. But otherwise, I would like to again mention that on the 20th of May, we have the second part of this webinar series where other colleagues of Miriam, Ella, and Rodrigo will also share some of their work. And that we have a wonderful newsletter with all the work that we do in Wildy and a great website where you can also learn more. So please sign up to those if you are interested in following the work of this project. But for the rest, I would like to really thank Rodrigo, Miriam. Appreciate you taking the time and everyone who's here. And I'll see you next time. Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Tim, and to Megan for everything.
Yes,
Yeah, thanks, Tim.
organization.